Hi, I'm Rick, and today we're going to talk about tabletop trees.
Sorry.
When you think about trees in popular historical fiction and fantasy, the place where most of us draw our inspiration from for our tabletop games and RPG adventures, you probably imagine Bilbo climbing to the top of a huge tree in Mirkwood to look about above the forest canopy, or Robin Hood and his merry men swinging down from the branches to ambush the sheriff on a forest road. These are iconic images, and while we have tons of wonderful 28mm buildings and dungeon walls and scatter terrain to bring our tabletop adventures to life, when it comes to forest trees, what's commercially available is typically very underwhelming. Today we're going to fix that. So let's examine what a realistic 28mm forest tree should look like. First, a reasonably sized deciduous tree in an old-growth forest can easily be 50 foot tall or more. In 28mm, which falls somewhere between 156 scale and 143rd scale depending upon your personal opinion, that's about a foot tall on the tabletop. For size, that's a really good starting point. Next, at 28mm, you're going to start to see individual leaves. This is the most challenging thing about modeling a 28mm tree. Sawdust or foam flock, while they look great on 15mm trees or HO scale train boards, they just don't particularly make a convincing tree at 28mm. Thirdly, a tree isn't a solid mass. You're going to have a lot of negative space where you can randomly see bits of the trunk through the canopy. And lastly, it has to be durable enough to stand up to the rigors of tabletop gaming. So how did I do this? I decided the best way to handle this was to build my trees on a branch-by-branch basis. As a starting off point, I happen to have a box full of these resin aquarium bonsai trees. These are available from one of those big box pet stores. You could alternately sculpt the whole thing with a metal armature, but I like to have a jumping off point for my creativity. You could also use an interesting stick or 3D print any readily available tree trunks. I personally like these because of their weight, and I don't like to base my terrain unless absolutely necessary. The soft plastic branches are just hot glued in, and they easily pull out with a pair of pliers. After you remove all of them, you're going to want to cut a lot of this extra material off the bonsai's base to make it look more like an old tree actually rooted into the ground. I've prepared one in advance. Now the branches. Take 3 strands of wire about 12 to 18 inches long and fold them in half over a Phillips screwdriver. I use this 17 gauge steel wire. I like to use a Phillips screwdriver because it gives me a handle to hold onto while I'm twisting the wires, and the tapered point allows me to slide the completed branch armature off the end when I'm done wrapping it. Now, begin twisting. And after a few inches, you want to take 2 wires and separate them out and pull them to the side. Then keep twisting the other 4 for another 2 inches or so. Pull another 2 out and keep twisting the others. Now you're going to want to twist all of these together just like that until you get to the end. You should end up with something that looks like this. Now you select a hole in your trunk where you want the branch to protrude from. And do the final shaping with your fingers and pliers. And now using some 5-minute epoxy, glue the branch into the hole you've selected. We're going to repeat this for all the branches you want on your first tier. I've completed the wire armatures for all of the lower tier branches and glued them in place. I let this set overnight to allow the epoxy to set to full strength. I've left the branches long so that I can trim them to their final shape in place. You're going to want to keep in mind that the branches are going to extend about 2 inches past the end of the wire on the completed tree. And if the wire armatures are too long, the clumps of foliage are going to be spaced too far apart and the tree is going to look very barren. This branch here, for example, looks like it's going to be too long. So we're going to have to trim the end and reshape things a bit. You're going to want to open this up a little bit so we have the Y feature on the ends of the branches for the wires. There, that's that one. Let's trim a few more of these. There. That looks pretty good. Now it's time to attach the tiny brass tubes to the ends of each wire. These will act as a socket to accept the ends of the soft plastic foliage and give a good strong attachment point. I use this 3/32 inch brass. You can use aluminum tubing. I cut it into pieces that are about 1/4 inch long. You slip the piece onto the end of one of the wires, and then using the wire cutter section of your pliers, I give it a good crimp to hold it in place. And then a small dab of cyanoacrylate adhesive to further ensure it's not going to fall off when we handle it. We need to do this to the end of each wire. There, now we'll let the glue set up for a bit. Now we're ready to start building up the branches around the wire armatures. For this, I use 2-part epoxy sculpt. You mix it 50-50 and knead the 2 parts together until you get a uniform color. Apply the epoxy sculpt around the armature with your fingers, working out from the trunk. You don't want to keep it fatter towards the trunk and let it taper out towards the branches. It can be kind of rough to start. Make sure you cover the whole thing, but leave the brass tubes protruding from the ends of it. Now, wet your fingers, and you can use the water with your fingers to actually smooth this stuff out. Once you're pretty happy with the shape, then I take sculpting tools like this wire brush and I try and replicate the texture that you see on the bonsai trunk itself. There's some grooves, some thick, some heavier than others. some messy, almost crumbly looking areas. And if you can wet your tools too, and it keeps the epoxy sculpt from sticking to them. We want to blend it in real nice. The branches don't have to be perfectly smooth. Since the rest of the tree is kind of gnarled looking, if there's some irregularities and lumps and bumps in the individual branches, it will actually fit in with the trunk a lot better and make it look more natural. Make sure you cover all of the wire. Sometimes it can be kind of sneaky and peek out on one side or the other. The ends don't have to be too thin because for the most part they're going to be covered by the foliage and the canopy. You're going to be looking at the trunk, the bulky portions of the branches, and the canopy itself. These ends are not as important as the rest of the tree. Epoxy sculpt has a working period of about 3 hours, so you have plenty of time to work with this. There's no rush. You can take your time. And we're just about done here. If you finish and this is dried and there's a part you're unhappy with, or you miss a spot or something where you felt some more filler should go, you don't have to bake epoxy sculpt, it air dries. So you can add to this later. You can file it, you can grind it. If you want another little branch protruding from a branch that you built, you can even drill a little hole and put another piece of wire in there to add it. And there we have it. That's our first tier of branches. Now we're going to repeat this probably 2 more times. This has to sit and cure overnight so I don't damage anything handling it. As you work your way towards the top and things get kind of tight in here, you can easily brush against this and mash the wet clay. So we're going to want to let this sit overnight. We're going to make some more branches, put them up a little higher, do the same exact thing again with the brass tubes on the end, cover them with epoxy sculpt, texture them, and then let that dry overnight, and then one more time to finish the top of the tree. Okay, I've finished the rest of the branches. I mostly used the holes that were already in the resin trunk that the original plastic branches were pulled out of, but I did carefully drill a few others in places where I wanted a branch where no hole was present. You'll notice I've made them shorter towards the top of the tree, and most of them have a slightly upward angle. I've also made a conscious effort to have the brass tubes not point at each other and to point to areas where it appears there will likely be voids in the canopy. You also want most of them to point in an upward direction because the weight of the soft, flexible plastic branches tends to pull them downwards. I've also added a few more roots, fixed some of the rough edges, and filled the rest of the unused holes with epoxy sculpt. This is sat and cured for a couple days now, so now we're ready for paint. I keep painting the trunk very simple. You can go completely crazy if you like with all sorts of tiny details. I just don't find that necessary. For a base coat, I use this dark gray automotive primer. So let's do that real quick. The dark gray primer coat's dry, so now we can dry brush on some color using some inexpensive craft paint. For the first color, I use a dark brown and a dark gray and mix up a dark dun color. Dry brush the whole trunk fairly heavily. Once this is dry, I go back in very lightly with a light gray to give the bark an aged silvery look. Next, you'll probably want to paint and flock a couple of areas on the base that actually aren't roots. Like this area here, we'll probably want to paint and flock that a dark brown. And this looks like a little rock, so we'll pick that up in a couple shades of gray. Now ready for some flock. The trunk and main branches are finished and dry, so it's time to add the foliage. For this I use a product called Briar Patch by Scenic Express. It's made up of little rings of tiny molded soft plastic leaves stacked onto plastic branches and flocked. It comes in about 4 different colors and 2 different forms. There's a bush and individual branches. Both yield the same amount of branches per package, about 10 or 12, and both cost the same. If you purchase the bush type, you'll have to just snip them apart yourself. There are 54 sockets to attach the branches to on this trunk, so I'll need 5 or 6 packs. Like the actual sculpting of the tree limbs themselves, you'll want to start at the bottom and work your way towards the top of the tree. Select a branch and trim the end so it comes to a point. A few of these you'll notice have a tiny additional branch that's attached to the main one. You can cut these apart or use them in areas where you want fairly dense foliage. Now just glue the branch into the brass tubes at the end of each limb with some cyanoacrylate adhesive, and repeat this at the end of each brass tube socket. After I finish gluing all the branches in, I mix up some 5-minute epoxy and I dab the areas where the plastic branches meet the brass sockets to further strengthen the joint. I'll also carefully touch up any of the damaged paint with dark gray or dark brown. And here it is, a realistic sized tree that has a trunk that splits into smaller limbs, that ends in branches, that have individual leaves that you can actually discern, just like a real tree. Now just add a few more, and you'll have a forest that any tree climbing hobbit or bandit would love to call home. I hope you enjoyed this video and try this project yourself. Be sure to subscribe to my channel for upcoming videos and share the link with your friends. Leave comments and questions below and I'll happily answer. Also be sure to watch till the end of the video where I give a list of what you'll need to complete this project.